Hello and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. So today's chapters are 1 Samuel chapter 9 and 10. Now remember yesterday, the children of Israel had asked for a king, one who could line up alongside the kings of the day and stand his ground. And so this verse opens by saying, in the tribe of Benjamin, there was a household of Kish. And in that household was Saul. He was as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel, and he was a head taller than anybody else. A fine specimen of a gladiator. That's what they had found themselves. And anyway, it says that his father said to this young man, listen, the donkeys are missing. Go find them. So they wandered over the hills. Now, I am up the west coast here, and I have been wandering through these hills looking at the flowers. You can see they begin to bloom. And we stumbled actually into a dead donkey. I nearly did this video over the donkey, but it stank so much. So sorry, you just have to put up with the West Coast flowers. Now, eventually they just gave up. And Saul says to his servant, what are we going to do? We've got to go back. Dad's going to be worried that we're missing. He says, listen, I know there's a prophet in this town. Let's go ask him. But meanwhile, the prophet had been told, about this time tomorrow, a guy's going to come up to you. He's the king. So they have this meeting, and Samuel says to him, listen, I'm going up to this high place to sacrifice. Come up with me, and I'm going to have a meal with you. I'm going to eat with you. And so he is introduced to Saul. Then chapter 10 says, the next day he takes a flask of oil, and he pours it on Saul's head. This is verse 1. And he kissed him, saying, has not the Lord anointed you over his inheritance? Saul, he's objecting. He's saying, I'm of the smallest tribe. I'm the most significant in my family. And Samuel have nothing of it. He says, no, you're the one that God has picked. And then he says, listen, tomorrow on your way home, you're going to see two women. And they're going to tell you everything's okay back with your dad. Then you're going to see three men carrying some sacrifices. They're going to give you some bread. And then you're also going to see a procession of prophets. And then the Spirit of God's going to come on you. You're going to prophesy with them. And so it's exactly as Samuel predicted it. And so as Saul turned to leave, God changed Saul's heart. And all these signs were fulfilled that day. And so what happens in verse 9 and 10 is that he begins to prophesy. It says the Spirit of God comes upon him and changes his heart, changes who he is. When he gets back to his house, his uncle says to him, where have you been? I heard you've spoken to the prophet. What did he say to you? He says, well, the prophet told me the donkeys were right. You see, at this stage, he's still a humble young man. Samuel then summons all the people together and he says, listen, I'm going to announce to you who your king is. He does it by lot and it eventually falls on Saul, but they can't find him. He's hiding away in the luggage supplies. They send someone to go and fetch him, and Samuel blows his trumpet and everybody says, long live King Saul. He says, hang on a minute, says Samuel. I'm going to tell you what the laws of kingship are. This is what a king is supposed to be. This is how you relate to a king. And then he goes back to his hometown. Now, there's some things that we can lift out of here regarding leadership. Firstly, anointing changes things. If God has called you to lead, you can ask him to anoint you for the task. When his Spirit comes upon you, it changes the way you lead. Gives you the authority, gives you the skills that you need. Secondly, I think Saul started correctly. He started humbly. He started back at his house, not living in grand palaces. And that's how God's leaders ought to be, among the people, without privilege, without extra finance, relating to the people. That's how he started out. And then it ends, this particular chapter, with some dissenters saying, who the heck is this guy? How can he lead us? Saul keeps quiet. He says, no problem. And he goes back to his house. And so as the new king is introduced to us, we see a man who starts okay, starts humble, and he has got God's anointing on him. So it was up to him now. Was he going to make good choices, stay with God, or was he going to go the way of the kings of the rest of the region? And I suppose when you move into authority, whether you're leading your family or leading your business, what happens to you? This is the challenge to me when I read this. What happens to you when power gets into your hands, when authority gets into your hands, when suddenly people are following you? What happens to you? Do you stay as God intends you to be, or does it warp you like the leaders of the world? This is how Jesus described the leaders of the world. They lord it over them. Selfish, lording it over them. That isn't God's way.